Everyone is familiar with the fantasy story The Lord of the Rings. Whether we're talking about the books, the movies, or the video games, most people are familiar with some version of the epic fantasy trilogy created by J.R.R. Tolkien. And it's in so many forms now you basically can't escape it. However, what some people are less aware of are the, say, less iconic versions that Tolkien discarded as he was writing his seminal masterpiece. These are publicly available and you can see them, but I'd like to take you guys today on a video through the 6 different ideas that Tolkien abandoned as he was writing Lord of the Rings. I'm very excited about this video because I haven't talked about it a lot on this particular channel, but I am a bit of a Tolkien nerd. In fact, just hold on one sec. Hold on one more sec. Okay. I'd just like to flex a little bit about the Tolkien collection I have, which I realize is something a little bit silly. I mean, some of these things are a bit, kind of a little bit goofy, but I get so few chances to sort of just talk about my love of this series and all the different things that are so wonderful about it. I first became acquainted with Tolkien and Lord of the Rings when I was a kid. It was one of the books that my parents used to read to me. The Hobbit, of course, was a very agreeable kid's story, so I loved that. We watched the Rankin Bass version as a kid. And then, when I grew older, I learned that there was The Lord of the Rings, which all my older brothers had read, my dad was a big fan of, and so that became a real way for me to connect with my older brothers and also my father by reading it and sort of sharing their love of that work of literature. And then, of course, when I eventually got further along and became like a scholar and got to study like medieval legends, Anglo-Saxon legends, a lot of the inspirations that Tolkien was working from when he put together The Lord of the Rings became really clear to me. And so that's really, over the years, it's just grown and developed and become deeper and more complex to me, and I just love all the different things present in it. But there's already tons of channels out there talking about all the different things that are going on in Lord of the Rings. So what I thought would be something unusual today is to talk about some of the different things that he abandoned and that he didn't end up doing as he was working on Lord of the Rings. But just to kind of give you an idea of like the collection here, I did want to spend some time. I have, of course, this wizard's costume. I'm going to take off this beard because that gets to be a bit much. But like you have here, the Elvish on here, Elbereth Gathaniel, and then I have like these dwarven runes. I don't know if they show up very well on there. The extended edition collections, like that's nothing particularly special. I feel like any self-respecting fan would have the extended editions. The Ralph Bakshi animated and the Rankin Bass Return of the King conclusion to the story, which I very much enjoy. This I just got recently, like a card game for Lord of the Rings. Battle for Middle-earth 1 and 2. The Lord of the Rings itself. This is a special edition that was released. It has a number of Tolkien's own illustrations in it. Tolkien was an artist. He actually did make and enjoyed painting. He did a number of artworks, and his artwork was originally meant to accompany Lord of the Rings. You can find some additional old books that have them as a cover. So like this is his picture of the Shire. They have his illustrations all in this special edition. It's got, of course, the ring lettering on the side here. This is a copy of the Silmarillion, the prequel to the Lord of the Rings that goes into all sorts of like epic stuff. This too has a lot of Tolkien's unpublished paintings and some artworks involved in that, maps, stuff like that. It's just a beautiful book. I love books like that. But oddly enough, we're not going to be talking about either one of these today, not in any real depth. What we are going to be talking about today, and which I'm very excited to talk about, are these. And these are the collected notes of Tolkien as he was writing Lord of the Rings. They were compiled by his son, Christopher Tolkien, who went through them following his father's death, organized them, made sense of his dad's handwriting, interpreted them, provided a bit of a timeline for them, and guided them as much as possible. It's really fascinating when you start looking into it, the amount of ideas that Tolkien really experimented with when he was writing Lord of the Rings. Because, of course, we look at something like this, and we're like, wow, this is perfect, this is awesome, this is amazing. How did he have that all just so completely, wonderfully, freshly formed in his head? And the simple answer is, he didn't. Tolkien didn't think that way. Most people don't think that way. He had extensive notes, extensive rough drafts, extensive things that he tried, and it wasn't all freshly formed. So we're going to go through that in depth today and talk about 6 different ideas that Tolkien abandoned as he was writing Lord of the Rings. So one of them is fairly innocuous at the start, but it does give an idea of the very sort of different tone that Tolkien was aiming for. The first one is that it was supposed to be about Bilbo's son, Bingo. And Bingo was supposed to be just returning the ring, not destroying it. Bingo, just as a note, was the name of a toy that Christopher Tolkien, J.R. Tolkien's son, had. Not everything with Tolkien is like really in-depth Anglo-Saxon, philological histories exploring things. Sometimes it's just, my son's got a toy, I'm going to name the hero after this toy. There was subplot about Bilbo getting married and then having a child. Now, the reason why Tolkien was thinking about going through this whole rigmarole with setting up a son that Bilbo hadn't had in the last book is because Tolkien had a problem. Tolkien had said at the end of Lord of the Rings that he lived happily ever after to the end of his days. So in Tolkien's mind, he couldn't write a book where Bilbo was unhappy. He couldn't write a story where Bilbo suddenly was depressed and had to go on another journey for any sort of purpose. It needed to be about somebody else being unhappy and going on a journey. It seems, honestly, a little bit silly because Tolkien rewrote an entire chapter of The Hobbit later. He eventually went back, after he'd come up with these new ideas about the ring, he went back and rewrote the whole chapter where Bilbo meets Gollum. So couldn't he have just rewritten the end where he says he lived happily ever after to the end of his days? And I think the answer is that to Tolkien, that was an extremely important part of how The Hobbit ended. The Hobbit ended with Bilbo being happy and content and settling down, and that was all. It didn't need to be anything more than that. And so to him, it was very important that Bilbo not be involved in this next adventure. Thus, Bingo. Originally, it was supposed to be a very Hobbit-centric story. That was what his publisher had asked from him. The publisher was like, everybody loved that little cute fantasy story you did, The Hobbit. Nobody knows what hobbits are. Like, they don't appear anybody else. So could you write maybe another fantasy story all about hobbits? And Tolkien was like, okay, yeah, cool. I can write a story that has a hobbit, that has like Bingo and his 3 friends wandering along, and I can have them meet with all sorts of different hobbits and doing hobbit things. And so it was originally a very much more limited story. What it was supposed to be about was about Bingo just returning the ring to the Lord of the Ring. If you've ever thought that Lord of the Rings is kind of an odd title for Sauron, Lord of the Rings was originally the name of kind of more a limited wizard who sort of lived in the area. There's this particular section from The Return of the Shadow, which is what the original draft was called, where Bingo was speaking with Gildor, as Frodo does in Lord of the Rings. But the conversation is a bit different. So Gildor says this: "It is my belief that the Lord of the Ring is looking for you. Is that bad or good?" "Bad, but how bad I cannot say. Bad enough if he only wants the ring back, which is unlikely. Worse if he wants payment. Very bad indeed if he wants you as well, which is quite likely. You put him off the scent, but they are hot on it now. Servants of the Lord of the Ring. People who have passed through the ring. Yes, if the ring overcomes you, you yourself become permanently invisible, and it is a horrible cold feeling. Everything becomes very faint, like gray ghost pictures against a black background in which you live, but you can smell more clearly than you can hear or see." Now, this should jive some of your memories, Because if you recall, this is a thing with the Nazgul in Lord of the Rings. The Nazgul are always expressed as sniffing a lot. When Frodo first meets them and they're hiding, there's this idea of like this strong sniffing sound. I think Merry even says later, "Did you mention the sniffing to them? I think it's very important." And that's because in Tolkien's idea, it was a big thing that the ring wraiths could smell better than they could hear or see. They mostly rely on their sense of scent. That's like a detail that just never comes up in Lord of the Rings, but it's still sort of in the background. Here's more from Gildor. "You are a ring wraith, then. You can wear clothes, but you become under the command of the Lord of the Rings. In the very ancient days, the Ring Lord made many of these rings and sent them out through the world to snare people. He sent them to all sorts of folk. The elves had many, and there are now many elf wraiths in the world, but the Ring Lord cannot rule them. The goblins got many, and the invisible goblins are very evil and wholly under the Lord." What we see things setting up here is that Tolkien has kind of a limited idea of the person who made the rings being kind of like a lord of ghosts. Maybe like, it's just sort of like a wizard, almost not quite a mischievous wizard, a very malevolent sort of wizard, somebody who likes seizing power and controlling power, but definitely not like a giant warlord with a monstrous tower and like tons of armies and stuff like that. A guy who has the command of a lot of ghosts, but that's kind of like the limit of the Ring Lord. He's very similar just to the Necromancer, which was Tolkien's original idea. And of course, Tolkien eventually did have Sauron was in disguise as the Necromancer, but he elevates Sauron to becoming a much more powerful and much more physical force as opposed to his original version of the Ring Lord. The second thing that Tolkien does, this is still very much in keeping. Tolkien is still with the goal of trying to make a story distinctly about hobbits. And so, the second thing he does is the character Strider is a hobbit. Strider, of course, in the books is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, king of Gondor, like this person who wanders the wilds but is secretly the lord of men. And in the original draft, that's not who he is. He's a hobbit. He is a ranger, but here ranger means kind of like a hobbit who lives outside and sleeps in a hole, almost closer to like a bum or sort of almost like a feral hobbit. There's even something of a suggestion, perhaps, of like Welsh, you might say, because they're described as being very sort of like dark-skinned and dark-haired, like Welsh people were known for being. Trotter is a hobbit who meets them in Bree. Bree, likewise, is a town entirely of hobbits. It's not, as it is in Lord of the Rings, a mixed city of hobbits and men, but Bree is just entirely made up of hobbits, and Butterbur is described as just like the fattest hobbit that Bingo has ever seen. Into this, they meet Trotter. And here's the selection from The Return of the Shadow. Suddenly, Bingo noticed that a queer-looking brown-faced hobbit, sitting in shadows behind the others, was also listening intently. He had an enormous mug, more like a jug, in front of him, and was smoking a long-stemmed pipe right under his rather long nose. He was dressed in dark, rough brown cloth, and had a hood on in spite of the warmth, and very remarkably, he had wooden shoes. Bingo could see them sticking out from under the table in front of him. So this is the big thing, the whole distinguishing feature of hobbits up to this point has been that hobbits are barefoot, that hobbits have just hard feet, that they can walk around barefoot all the time. And suddenly we meet Trotter, who wears wooden shoes. This is part of where he gets his name, because he makes a trotting sound everywhere he goes. Trotter is a very mysterious character. At different points, Tolkien toys around with the idea that maybe Trotter is Bilbo in disguise, but he soon abandons that, because again, Bilbo needs to live happily ever after. He is still a cool guy. He knows all the stuff about the ring race. He has the line like, do you want to be captured by them? They are terrible. And the reason for that comes up later. When we get to the Council of Elrond, this happens. Thus it was that Frodo learned how Trotter had tracked Gollum as he wandered southwards, through Fangorn Forest and past the Dead Marshes until he had himself been caught and imprisoned by the Dark Lord. Ever since I have worn shoes, said Trotter with a shudder, and though he said no more, Frodo knew that he had been tortured and his feet hurt in some way, but he had been rescued by Gandalf and saved from death. So, this already is a pretty awesome setup. Trotter is a fighting hobbit who sleeps outside, knows all these tricks about the wild, knows all stuff about these magical ghost creatures that are chasing them. Now also it's revealed that he wears shoes because his feet are horribly tortured and he can't bear the strain of it anymore. But it's even more awesome than that, because in the margins of the notes, according to Christopher, there's the sketch of an idea that Trotter actually doesn't have feet, that his wooden shoes are wooden feet, prosthetics, which means Tolkien almost had the first amputee fantasy hero. Now, eventually, of course, he discarded this. There was another character. Boromir was in the later portions of the story. Boromir was the son of the King of Ond. He wasn't the son of the steward or anything like that. And after a while, Tolkien split up Boromir, son of the King of Ond, into two characters, Aragorn and the Boromir that we know. And once he had Aragorn, it made better sense to make Aragorn into Strider, and he discarded Trotter. So, I can't disagree with that. There's a lot awesome with Aragorn. I love Aragorn as a character, but I do wish we could have gotten Trotter somewhere. He's just a really cool guy. Third main thing it has to do with the character of Treebeard. So a lot of these characters underwent pretty big changes. Treebeard, of course, everybody knows. He's the walking tree that we meet in the Two Towers, and he's a fun character, and everybody loves him. He's kind of almost like a kindly uncle. Again, in the original, not that kindly. He's a bit darker. In the drafts, Gandalf again does not show up to join up with the hobbits. There is a version where he's originally the person who stops them on the road in Lord of the Rings, when there's a strange character who pulls up on a horse, sniffs around under a cloak. That's originally Gandalf. It's not a ring wraith. Originally, the character who shows up on the road to see them is Gandalf, and he uncovers his cloak. He's like, "Hey, Bingo, I know you're around here somewhere. Come out." But that quickly changes to a ring wraith. Presumably because Tolkien decides it's much more interesting if Gandalf isn't along with the hobbits. But then you have the question, why didn't Gandalf join them? And when they rejoined Gandalf in Rivendell, what he says to them is there are many powers greater than mine for good and evil in the world. I was caught in Fangorn and spent many weary days as a prisoner of the giant Treebeard. Now, Tolkien never writes out specifically what he's planning with Treebeard. There's a suggestion here of just that expresses that Treebeard is, as he says in the actual book,
I am not altogether on anybody's side, because nobody is altogether on my side.
There's different ideas that are suggested at different portions. There's a short segment where Frodo realizes that what he's taken, he thinks he's in a forest of trees, and then he realizes that he's in a grove of very tall flowers, and there's a voice asking what he's doing in his garden. Kind of a more straightforward giant in some ways. Just like an ordinary fee-fi-fo type giant. He even has said that Treebeard once had a castle in the Black Mountains, and many thanes and followers who look like young trees when they stand. It's more kind of like lordly Treebeard, almost like a baron, a thane who has followers. Not like, the communal individualist Treebeard who just brings people together and talks and says, "Hey, should we maybe do something about all this?" This is kind of a more straightforward giant who has followers, who has a whole army, and just happens to live in the forest. He's not really as much of a plant elemental. He's more like a kind of a Jack the Giant type giant. The fourth thing to talk about is Boromir. Boromir's a bit different also. We've already talked about that when he first shows up. Boromir is the Prince of And, which is what they originally have for Gondor. In that version, he's kind of a proto-Aragorn. Sometimes he's like very honorable, very just. Other times he's just basically a big grunt. He's like the big man who's helping them with all the stuff, carrying luggage, rescuing hobbits, things like that. After Tolkien puts in Aragorn, decides to split the character into Aragorn and Boromir, then Boromir becomes the traitor. He becomes kind of like a Grima Wormtongue type situation. And Tolkien kind of struggles what to do with him. This is the portion that he writes after, like, he's kind of like sketching out ideas. Where should things go from this point on? He's trying to get an idea of like where the story goes overall. And he says, Boromir and Aragorn, who notices a change in Boromir, who is keen to break off the chase and go home, reach Minas Tirith, which is besieged by Sauron, except at the back. Siege is briefly told from the point of view of watchers on battlements. Evil has now hold of Boromir, who is jealous of Aragorn. The Lord of Minas Tirith is slain, and the people choose Aragorn. Boromir deserts and sneaks off to Saruman to get his help in becoming Lord of Minas Tirith. So this is a very much darker version of Boromir. This is a guy who is like fully going in all the way toward being a traitor. Even like Tolkien even thinks about it and is like, should, Boromir repent and become better? And then he's like, no, I think Aragorn should just kill him. There's another portion of the idea where Tolkien thinks maybe Aragorn becomes Lord of Minas Ithil and Boromir becomes Lord of Minas Tirith. He's trying to figure out different ideas here. However, when Tolkien writes the scene at the Fords of Rauros, he writes the scene where Boromir tries to take the ring from Frodo, and then basically after he writes out what happens at the Fords of Rauros, where Boromir fights defending Merry and Pippin, dies heroically, and has this kind of last moment with Aragorn, he never really substantially changes it. What is in Lord of the Rings is more or less what Tolkien actually wrote down when he got to that portion in the writing, and apparently felt, this is perfect, I'm never changing it, that's going to be like what we stick with. Now for the fifth one is going to be a bit fun. Because one of the things, Tolkien doesn't do a lot of romance, but he does have a love triangle of sorts in Lord of the Rings. And that's caused a bit of sort of pairing wars over the time. I think people, especially who have seen the movies, have always been very sympathetic to Éowyn. She's the sort of, everyday girl. She's the hard, rough and ready, the person who really wants to do it. She's a girl with a crush, and it's very adorable, the kind of scenes between her and Aragorn. She's more there with Aragorn than Arwen is. Arwen doesn't seem to show up much in the movies. And Arwen is in the movies more than she's in the books. This is, quite frankly, kind of like an odd portion of the books, that Arwen is barely there. I didn't even realize at first that Arwen and Aragorn had a thing until I got to like that very end section where they get married. Big surprise for me as a kid. And some people, and by some people I mean at least my sister and my mother, are like very much, well, maybe Aragorn should go with Éowyn. Maybe, the movies will change it. This is what they said when the movies were coming out. They're like, I think maybe the movies will change it so that he gets together with Éowyn. Like, they did really want him to get together with Éowyn. There's a reason why people might think that way. There's a reason why people might have that take, and it's because originally, in Tolkien's drafts, Éowyn was Aragorn's love interest. Arwen does not really appear in the sort of initial early drafts of like what happens at Rivendell and stuff like that. She's just flat out not there. So this is what Christopher Tolkien says about this stuff between Éowyn and Aragorn. The significance of the meeting of Aragorn and Éowyn, on the other hand, was destined to survive, though fundamentally transformed. After she had gone, he stood still, looking at the dark doors and taking little heed of other things. At the meal before the departure, Aragorn was silent, but his eyes followed Éowyn, struck out. And when she brought the wine to the guests, long she looked upon Aragorn, and long he looked upon her. And then instead he substituted, as she stood before Aragorn, she paused suddenly, and looked upon him, as if only now had she seen him clearly. He looked down upon her fair face, and their eyes met. For a moment they stood thus, and their hands met as he took the cup from her. "Hail, Aragorn, son of Arathorn," she said. Aragorn said, "If I live, I will come, Lady Eowyn, and then maybe we will ride together." Then Eowyn smiled and bent her head gravely. So, I mean, Tolkien doesn't write a lot of romance, but when he does, boom, like 90 miles a minute. It's very in keeping, with the sort of medieval stories that he's writing from. There's not a lot of long, heartfelt conversations in ancient medieval epics. It's just, hey, that's a cute girl. She is immediately impressed by the hero, because why not? There's not a lot of time for these sorts of things. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of detail about how the romance would have further unfolded. All we really get is this stuff about what happens when they first meet that indicates that initially Tolkien was planning for them to fall in love and get married. Tolkien really never really gets that far. There's a note that he writes, which is this: "Cut out the love story of Aragorn and Eowyn. Aragorn is too old and lordly and grim. Make Eowyn the twin sister of Eomund, a stern Amazon woman. Probably Eowyn should die to avenge or save Theoden." So Tolkien was thinking of doing it, and then is like, nah, Aragorn's too old. Aragorn's like 80 in the books. Of course, Arwen is 3,000, but, we try not to think about that too much. There is a note musing whether Aragorn actually did love Eowyn and then never married after her death. But apparently he also discarded that idea and felt that Aragorn should marry someone, and so he invented the character of Arwen, sort of made another version of the Beren and Luthien story. The last thing, the sixth thing that I want to talk about, may seem a little trivial, but it's cool, so I really want to talk about it. A lot of the story is really very similar from this point. If you read through, War of the Ring, honestly, I'm glad I got the book War of the Ring, but not a lot changes in War of the Ring from, substantially from, what it finally is. There is, though, a very cool moment in the very last book of the notes, Sauron defeated. Frodo, at this point, goes all the way up to Mount Doom. It is now Frodo. He is in Mount Doom. He throws the ring, and here's the shape. Nazgul shape at the door. Frodo is caught in the fire chamber and cannot get out. "Here we all end together," said the ring wraith. Frodo is too weary and lifeless to say nay. "You first," said a voice, and Sam, with Sting, stabs the Black Rider from behind. And it's not just any Black Rider. Later versions identify the Nazgul that Sam stabs as the Witch King, or as he's called then, the Wizard King. So Sam almost backstabbed the Witch King of Angmar. And that's just such a cool detail. It may seem a bit little, but I love that little detail. There's other things, less important. At one point, Tolkien muses with the idea of Gimli being the one person to die in Moria, but he never really writes that out. Gandalf is the one who dies in Moria, but at first it's a Black Rider that kills Gandalf, and then that's shifted to the Balrog. At one point, Tolkien considers the idea of Saruman being the one who kills Gandalf in Moria, but doesn't go with that idea either. Both of those are pretty interesting ideas, but I think we can all agree that the Balrog is a lot more dramatic and just out of nowhere. There's also, when in the scene where Gandalf comes back to Isengard, so it shows Saruman kind of coming out very affable and trying to please and being we really need to work together. What about our different spheres of influence? And it's said that he is sent out mostly to beg for an honest day's living, and that's kind of where it leaves Saruman in the original drafts. Until Tolkien comes up with the Scouring of the Shire. So there's a bunch of other smaller differences. The ones though that I've highlighted are the big ones. I think they're really fascinating. I think it's really interesting. Any one of these, honestly, I think would have made for cool stories. I almost would love seeing spin-offs of a lot of these different ideas. But I wanted to talk about these rough drafts because these rough drafts had a very profound impact on me personally as a writer. As somebody who loved Lord of the Rings so entirely, I had this idea of great writers have it all just in their head. They just perfectly conceive the story and they write it out perfectly the very first time and they never do anything differently. And it was only when I had the opportunity to read through these that I realized, no, even your heroes, even the people who write great works of literature, go through a lot of rough drafts, go through a lot of second guessing points where they're not sure what they want to do with storylines or characters. They don't know what's going to happen. They might have plans, all sorts of plans for different characters that they eventually end up throwing out and not going anywhere with. And that was really profound to me and really opened up for me the fact that anybody can do writing and write great stories. And so I wanted to share that with you guys. Hopefully you also find that helpful in different ways. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you.